what is your view about the current situation and, most important probably, the way out? What
The current situation.
Yeah.
The situation for the last year has been exceptionally difficult. And when the IMF was called in, I would say this is one of the countries that has posed the biggest challenges almost of all time to the
Can
IMF.
you explain it a little bit why it is more difficult than, for instance, Greece or
Right.
Argentina?
Greece was also Greece and Argentina are definitely contenders for the most difficult.
Yeah.
But what's exceptional about Ukraine? First of all, Ukraine, since its transition, has never really gotten its feet on the ground and had a strong and durable growth path. And it's the result of many factors that Ukraine, unlike many other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, didn't have the EU framework to sort of provide an anchor for its transition. It didn't have a very strong internal constituency for reform and loosening the grip of state control in a way that didn't just breed corruption. So the transition was very difficult in Ukraine. Ukraine has lurched from one crisis to another since its transition. I mean, it's had 8 IMF programs. Only one program has been completed. Only one program has the IMF been able to complete reviews and disperse all of the funds. And the reason why is because Ukraine simply hasn't implemented the policies that were agreed upon in the program, and to the detriment of the performance of the Ukrainian economy. So when these political problems emerged in late 2013, they were a trigger for vulnerabilities that had been in place and even growing over the last 20 years. So that's one thing. It's so deeply rooted in the Ukrainian economy that problems exist and that there are vulnerabilities to any shock that comes up. Second thing is there's an armed conflict in Ukraine, and the IMF traditionally does not get involved in situations where there's an armed conflict. It has been very careful in almost all circumstances to define what is a post-conflict situation, a situation in which the conflict is largely over, there's a government in place that's able to take measures, and that the conflict itself isn't dragging the economy down. So Ukraine is different. This is really an exception for the IMF to get involved in a conflict situation. So that's a second very major departure from the sort of traditional crisis, right?
Yeah.
But there's also the problem of Russia, that there is a very large, very important neighbor for Ukraine that, from all signs, appears pretty intent on not wanting Ukraine to succeed. You think about it, the European Union really did want Greece to succeed. The United States really did want Mexico to succeed. So typically, really major crises get resolved quickly. You've got to have some neighboring countries that are pulling for the country, and that is not what's happening in Ukraine. So that's a really difficult set of circumstances. Add to that, where I think Ukraine doesn't differ so much from other crises, that there is just a large amount of financing that would be necessary alongside very strong policies to get the economy back on track.
How would you define this success? You say Russia doesn't want Ukraine to succeed. You mean Russia wants to have a failed state on its border with permanent unrest or prolonged conflict or frozen conflict?
When I ask that question to many people who are closer in proximity to Ukraine, the standard answer is typically that should Ukraine resolve this political problem, conflict problem, and put in place very strong measures that made the potential of Ukraine that much larger and position Ukraine to realize the potential. It would be an example right on Russia's border of an extremely successful country.
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine has the power to become that extremely successful country. And is that something that Russia wants to see? I think that is the questions continuously being asked to me.
Mm. Well, I know these views, but I have a little bit problem that you said at the beginning Ukraine was basically a very big disappointment over more than 2 decades. I think that not for all these problems Russia can be blamed.
Oh, absolutely not.
And now suddenly...
No, this is a homegrown problem too.
Yeah.
Yes.
And now suddenly Russia should be interested in this, or preventing this success of the, I don't know, Orange Revolution or whatever revolution.
Well, I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say prevent it, although some people do say that to me.
Yeah.
I think it's, in my view, even more a question of how much does Russia want to see it. Because, as I said, when countries are in crisis and they recover, it's typically because they have neighbors that really want to see them succeed. Even if it's, for example, in Europe, not an EU country, but Turkey in 2000, 2001. I think both the United States and the European Union strongly wanted to see Turkey succeed. They were eager in every way possible to make the right things happen.
Yeah. Because, for instance, from the European Union point of view, this whole Eastern neighborhood, Eastern partnership programs have the aim to create a ring of friends and say stable, prosperous countries from security, migration, trade, and other points of view. And now the implication would be that Russia is not interested in this, in case of Ukraine.
Or certainly not willing to put out the effort.
I don't know.
In a
I think that,
way.
of course, Russia is not ready to accept, so to say, this European Union approach to Ukraine. And in fact, I have written a lot about failures which European Union did before this Vilnius Eastern Partnership Summit and afterwards. So there was a lot of misperception on both sides, I would say. And the basic failure of the European Union, as I see it, was to put this Ukrainian choice before the alternative, either with the EU, or either with Europe, or with Russia. This was stated several times by the Commissioner Füle and by others in the European Union. And this, of course, was, I think, a wrong choice or a wrong statement, because it mistakenly put Ukraine for the choice of these 2 alternatives, which are, I think, impossible, because Ukraine will be always between European Union and Russia. And by the way, one of the reasons for the current economic situation is basically the collapse of Ukraine's trade relation with Russia, which is the biggest trade partner. And without somehow trying to restore these trade and other relations, I'm very skeptical that Ukraine economy can succeed in stabilization and sustainable development in the future.
Right.
Yeah.
So this puts the IMF in an incredibly difficult situation because, first of all, it's not used to dealing with countries in conflict. But even there, I would say I can understand the argument for getting the IMF involved, because clearly policies in Ukraine, even during this period of conflict where policies are never going to be great, I mean, undertaking the kind of structural reform that Ukraine needs in the midst of a conflict is a tall order. But at least the IMF has the ability to set up a program, to set up benchmarks for structural reforms, to monitor them, and to relate disbursements of funding to the success in accomplishing those objectives. So the IMF is the obvious place to go to get that basic technical expertise. Where the IMF is not well suited for Ukraine now is, first, providing financing. I don't believe that the IMF should be providing what's called exceptional financing above what are the normal access limits for countries. Because the risks in Ukraine are too great, the IMF cannot feel confident that its objectives are going to be met. It can hope they are, but it can't be confident like in other countries. And I don't think that the IMF's resources should be put at that risk. That's not what the IMF was made to do. Second, it's clear that Ukraine doesn't have a huge amount of external debt, but it has its external debt is not trivial, and that the Ukraine program is underfunded, clearly, as we're hearing right now. And at the same time, Ukraine is repaying its creditors. It just paid $1.6 billion when the Naftogaz bond came due in September. Earlier in the year, it paid off another bond that came due. That they're paying out to private creditors when the program is underfunded just doesn't make any sense at all. Yet the fund is not able to say, we need to call a standstill on debt repayments, and that needs to be part of the money that we're going to find to finance. So that the fund doesn't have that ability is a big problem. Again, in the case of Ukraine, just as it was in the case of Greece.
There is not only IMF present in Ukraine, but also these advisory groups from European Commission.
Of course, right.
And a lot of bilateral efforts from United States, Germany, I think France also. Is there any coordination?
I can't speak to that because I'm not involved inside the IMF. I'm sure there is some coordination. Yeah. Is it adequate? I have no idea.
No, because I've been involved a couple of years ago in this consulting business, the so to say assistance provided by the European Union in technical assistance. This was this TESIS program, and I personally was in Kiev advising statistical office in implementing basically Eurostat data standards. And there have been a lot of similar efforts going around. I can remember that people at the statistical office complained that they have 2 or 3 visits from Western experts from the World Bank, from the European Commission, from private companies, and that people complained that they do not have time for actual work. So this was, but this is probably the standard practice. Yeah.
Right.
But and what is your perception of the outlook for Ukrainian economy? Can you?
Well, I have to say, I have 2 modes of thinking about this. One is a very cynical one, which is that there is not going to be enough money to make Ukraine work, especially given the fact that corruption and inefficiency are very deep-rooted in the Ukraine economy, and they are making things very expensive. And in a situation of conflict, it's hard to see how those problems get taken care of adequately. It's not clear that Russia has an interest in seeing Ukraine work, and as a result, that's a big negative for Ukraine. And some would say this is actually all about energy. There is a substantial amount of oil and gas underneath the ground of eastern Ukraine.
You mean this is the real reason?
Scratch around on the internet a little bit, and you will come up with this view. that there's a substantial amount of oil and gas under the ground in eastern Ukraine. It's probably recoverable in an economic way, and should, over the course of a long period of time, years, a decade, 2 decades, I don't know, should this get developed, it would challenge Russia's grip on the energy market in this part of the world. So Russia has an interest in maintaining power in this part of Ukraine, or taking power. Ukraine has an interest in keeping those oil and gas reserves for itself. In Ukraine's current state, when you look at oil and gas, major oil and gas reserves being put or being introduced into a system that is so institutionally poor as Ukraine, is usually not doing the country a lot of good. In other words, it is used to kind of support the status quo in a sense. So there's a way of looking at Ukraine and saying, like, the outlook is bleak. Either Russia gets, if you see it, this is an energy, essentially an energy conflict. Russia keeps that oil and gas, in which case Russia keeps its grip on the region in terms of energy, which, as you know, is huge in terms of overall power. Or Ukraine gets it, but has no, it doesn't have the environment to undertake reforms that allow it to use the energy revenues wisely, and it just feeds this continuation of a corrupt and inefficient state. So there's one look at Ukraine that says, look, there's nothing here that's ever going to work. That's a very cynical view. I have to say, if I'm working on Ukraine and thinking about how the program is being constructed and pushed ahead, you have to put the cynical view out of your mind, because otherwise you just say, give up, don't put any more money in the place and just let it go. So there's a hopeful view, which is that there can be some sort of coming to terms between Russia and Ukraine, that they're neighbors and that they should work together, and they actually can live side by side, whether the eastern part of Ukraine is in Ukraine or in Russia or somewhere in between. You figure out how to live next to each other in a peaceful and prosperous way. Ukraine can undertake the reforms necessary to wrest the control from oligarchs' and vested interests, and it can really start to run a normal economy. It can find new trade links in Western Europe and redevelop ones in Russia. And these things can all be done. It just takes will and some financing in the interim period, and you just keep pushing at it.
Well, the question is why it should be different now than it used to be.
Countries change. Countries change. Let me tell you. Look at the Philippines. The Philippines during the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s was a basket case. It was what the IMF called a prolonged user. Year after year after year after year, the Philippines came. They never really got a handle on the problems in the economy. They were poor. They didn't grow. They were constantly in debt. And gradually, I'd say more in the past 15 or so years, they have undertaken a lot of reforms. The Philippines is now the South Korea of Asia. I mean, if you look at the Philippines now, you just say, was that really the country that we used to know in the 60s, 70s, and 80s? So countries do change.